Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Deuteronomy in our continuing survey of the Old Testament. The title of the book, we usually use a title that we get from the Greek. The Greek name is Deuteronomion. That word duo, that sounds like something, the second of something. And then namas is the Greek word for law. So the second law or second giving of the law, Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 18 talks about how it shall come about when he, that is a future king, sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law, that is a second law, it's not really a second, it's a copy, on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. That's the Greek name. The Hebrew name, in very, very ancient times, uh, typically you would have the title taken from the first words of the book. That's what happens here. The Hebrew name is Ele Ha-Devarim. These are the words, and that's the opening title. Notice these are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness, in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Hazerath and Dizhab. They're ready to go into the land. That's the setting. But before they go into the land, before they cross the Jordan and go into the promised land, they are again given the law, this second giving of the law. And that's what Deuteronomy is going to be all about. Now, I have to talk a bit about something called suzerain treaties. This is something that we had in the second millennia BC. You had them later on too, but they had a different format. And the suzerain treaty of the second millennia BC would follow a particular format. It would begin with a preamble stating the parts, the different people that are involved. A suzerain, by the way, is a big king, and then he would form a treaty with little kings around him, little nations. So the preamble would talk about who is involved in the formation of this treaty, and then you would have a historical prologue that would talk about their past history. Now, it didn't have to be very long, but the history, and maybe they'd been friends, for like forever, or maybe there'd been periods of conflict, but they've come out of that, and now they're going to form this treaty. Next, there would be the stipulations to the treaty. I agree to do this, and you agree that you won't, set up an army on my border, things like that. How are our nations going to get along? Next, we have a requirement about the deposit and reading of the covenant. That is, each of the parties, the big king and the little king, are each going to get a copy of the treaty. Now, remember how we're going to read about two tablets of the law. That's the idea here. They each get their own copy, and each one will take it back to his temple or his holy place and deposit it there. And they agree that at certain specific times they will bring out their copies of the covenant and they will read them publicly in the hearing of all the people, so that no one can ever say, "Oh, gee, I forgot." There's going to be regular reminders. Next, there are going to be witnesses to the covenant, and finally, there will be a series of curses and blessings. And what I just gave you is the outline for a suzerain treaty, but I also just gave you the outline of the book of Deuteronomy. It follows that very precise outline from the second millennia. Remember, I said later on in the first millennia, it changes. But in the second millennia BC, that is more than 1,000 years before the coming of Christ, in that 1,000 year period before the 1,000 years leading up to the time of Christ, that's the format that they would use, and that's the time when Moses gives us this law. Moses has brought the people out of Egypt. They've been in the wilderness, and now they're getting ready to go into the promised land. And now we have this, can I call it a treaty? This covenant that is set up between God and his people. Now, here's the outline. Notice we've got the preamble, the historical prologue, the stipulations, the blessings, the cursings, the witnesses, the succession clause, and so on. In the first section, we see what God did, especially there in the historical prologue that takes most of chapters 1 all the way to the end of chapter 4. It's a retelling of everything that happened in the wilderness. Now, it's in brief. We already read about that in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, but now it's a retelling of that. And then starting with chapter 5, we have the stipulations. Here's what Israel is to do as a result of what God has done. And that takes us all the way to chapter 26. And then finally, what God will do, the blessings and the cursings, the witnesses, the succession. He calls heaven and earth to be a witness. And we're going to go through and look at those aspects. So chapter 5 and verse 4, this is after the preamble, this is after the walking through what had been done, that historical prologue, that the Lord spoke to you face to face at the mountain from the midst of the fire. Notice he's still describing what God did in the past. While I was standing, this is Moses speaking, while I was standing between the Lord and you at the time to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. Moses went up as a representative, as an intermediary between God and man. And he says that as God said, and now we have the Ten Commandments that are given. We've seen them already in Exodus chapter 20. Now, here in Deuteronomy chapter 5, they are given again. And of course, as we saw before, the first four are directed toward God: no other gods, no idols, God's name is to be holy, and the ordinance with regard to the Sabbath day, keeping the Sabbath as a memorial to God. And so those first four commands are directed toward God. The last six are directed toward people, beginning with respect for authority, specifically for parents. And then notice how I say no murder, no adultery, no stealing, no false witness. That's actually how it's described. The word lo, which is no, and then whatever it's telling you not to do. They are very brief, these ones toward men. And then the last one is about no coveting, but that actually is going to have a little bit of an explanation, and it will be embellished just a bit about all the different types of coveting. You don't covet your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's house or anything that belongs to your neighbor. But notice that's still toward people. So all of these laws are perfect. They are described as spiritual, not just physical, although they have physical outgrowths from them. But they're dealing not just with the outside, but with the inside. How do I know that? Because the last law, the law of coveting, deals with the inside, and it talks about not coveting your neighbor's wife. Well, wait a minute, that dealt with adultery, so it deals with the other things, but the inside quality of those things. So they're perfect, they're spiritual. While some of them resemble laws of society, especially those last six, except for the coveting one, they far surpass those laws in their intent. And Jesus pointed this out in his Sermon on the Mount, where he says, "You've heard it said," and then he'll actually quote from one of these laws. And then he'll say, but really, it has a greater implication about what you do on the inside. You've heard that it was said, don't murder. And that was part of the law. But I say to you, it's not just about murder, it's about what you think about your neighbor. How have you murdered him in your heart? Have you had unjust, unrighteous thoughts toward him? The same thing is true with all of those laws. They have a corresponding corollary. So when a duty is commanded, there is a contrary sin which is forbidden. And when a sin is forbidden, there is a contrary duty which is being commanded. They are not merely a moral code, they are also covenantal stipulations. And we've talked in the past about covenant. We're going to see it here too. God is entering into a covenant with his people, and this is the text of the covenant. So they contain cursing and blessing formulas. We saw those in Leviticus chapter 26. We're going to see them again at the end of Deuteronomy. And they will be interspersed all throughout the commands, but then at the end, we're going to see several chapters given over to that covenant blessing and cursing, and how they are going to be instructed to actually have a blessing and cursing ritual once they get into the land. So we get to chapter 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. Our Jewish friends take that first line, Hear, O Israel, Shema Israel, and notice that word Shema just means hear. And they refer to this section as the Shema, which it starts off, the hearing, the thing you're supposed to hear, the important thing. And they take this, and I think this is a doctrinal statement, not just for our Jewish friends, but for us Christians too. Notice it is monotheistic. The Lord is our God. The Hebrew says, Adonai Eloheinu. The Lord is our God. Adonai Echad. The Lord is one. If you wanted to render that, the Lord is the Lord alone, that would work too. But the Lord is one. I think that's probably a better translation. Notice this is a doctrinal statement that is monotheistic. There's only one God. And let me just say for the record, I agree. There's only one God. By the way, I am Trinitarian in my theology, but any discussion about any understanding about the Trinity has to begin with the fundamental premise: there's only one God, not three gods, not two. No, there's only one God. And so, any time we go with the Trinity, and we do, I go in that direction, but I have to first lay that foundation. There's only one God. Don't try to make that into three. There's not three gods. One God. We continue verse 5. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Jesus calls this the great and foremost commandment, Matthew chapter 22, verse 38. And that brings up the question, why is this the greatest commandment? And the answer is because it includes every other command. It includes every other command. If you love God, then you're going to keep the other commandments. I find that not in just the Old Testament, but I find it in the New Testament as well. Read in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 17, but whoever has the world's goods and beholds his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Notice we haven't even got to love your neighbor as yourself, which is given in the law. But just loving the Lord your God means that you are required to also love others. Verse 6, we continue, these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons and talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. And that's basically every area of life. If you're not sitting down, then you're rising up, or you're walking, and whatever you're doing. This isn't just something to do once and you forget it. This isn't even something you do once a week and then forget it. This is something that goes with you day by day. Verse 8, you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. Now, my Jewish friends actually will take a little box, and they'll put a little piece of scripture there and literally tie it to their hand and literally tie it to their forehead. And that's okay if that serves to remind you. But I think the idea behind this is that everything that you think with your mind, everything that you do with your hand, is to reflect these commands, the Word of God. Verse 9, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. And we refer to this as a mezuzah. In fact, if you go to my sister's house, she used to live with my mother, and my mother's with the Lord now. To this day, she still has a little mezuzah on the doorpost, and it's got a little tiny piece of scripture, probably from this passage. I've never opened it and looked. But again, she takes that literally. But I think symbolically what it's saying is your whole house is given over to the Lord. Your house reflects these commands. They're to be written in your heart, on your doorposts, on your head, on your hand, everywhere, everything you do, say, and think. Now, that's the Ten Commandments and the Shema. That's in chapters 5 and 6. When we get to chapter 7, we start off, chapter 7 through the end of chapter 11, are going to give us the foundation of the commands. And we're going to talk about those commands. In chapter 7, we'll see the promise. God gives a promise to drive out the nations. And Israel, therefore, is called to be holy, set apart, and distinct. In other words, they're not driving out the nations to be just like them. In fact, they're to stamp out paganism and to do away with those wrong things. Next, starting in chapter 8 and through the end of chapter 10, there's a reminder of God's continuing faithfulness in the wilderness. And they're taken on another journey back through the wilderness, but this time with the faithfulness of God pointed out. And so they're told several times in chapter 8, the command is repeated, don't forget, remember, remember, remember. As we have this reminder. We get to chapter 9, they're told to remember the golden calf incident and how they disobeyed, and yet God still forgave them. God, God was ready to say, okay, you guys are done in the wilderness. You guys die here and never again. I'll just start over again with Moses. And Moses interceded, and that didn't happen. In chapter 10, they're told to circumcise your heart. Yes, they're going to have physical circumcision, but they're also it is going to go beyond just the outward action. It's going to go to their heart and what they believe and what they do from the heart. We get to chapter 11, and now we see the results of keeping the covenant. In the first part of chapter 11, they're told they're going to possess the land, and God's going to drive out the Canaanites. Verse 13 and following, we have a blessing and a promise regarding the rains. It's not like Egypt, where they always have the Nile River, so it doesn't rain in Egypt. But in Canaan, it's all about the early and latter rains. It rains in the rainy season, then it gets very dry in the summer. And if it doesn't rain, everything dries up and dies. And so God's going to give the rains if they obey. And if they don't, he's going to withhold them. Um, and then beginning verse 26, we have blessings and a curse. Now we're going to see much more of that, but already that's given here in chapter 11, verse 26 and following. Starting with chapter 12, then, we have the related commands in something of the same order that we had the Ten Commandments, so that in chapter 12 through 13, we have warnings about adultery, idolatry, dealing with the first command, the first three commands: no other gods and no graven images, and keep his name holy. And then in chapter 14, we have laws about worship. Remember, that's the Sabbath, and so that's the Sabbath command. That's 14 and 15. In chapter 16, really beginning halfway through the chapter, we have qualifications for leaders, and the point is made that these commands aren't just for the people, and the king gets to do whatever he wants. You went down to Egypt, and the king was the command. His word was law. But no, God's people. With God's people, the priests, the elders, and even the king are all supposed to be under the law. And so this goes back to that whole parental authority thing that we saw in the fifth commandment. Children, obey your parents, and also obey your leaders is the idea behind that. And then we have commands in chapter 19 about war and peace. Remember the command about killing, thou shalt not kill. Actually, it's probably thou shalt not murder. There are times when they're instructed to kill. But they don't take that upon themselves. That's not, I don't like you, you cut me off in traffic, so therefore I'm going to kill you. It's not that sort of thing. And then we have just laws of living that, for example, sexual purity and theft and pledges and all different sorts of things that are given in the rest of the stipulations. Chapter 18 and verse 15, this is part of that law of the leader. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, Moses is speaking, from among you, from your countrymen. You shall listen to him. This is according to all that you asked of the Lord your God in Horeb. Horeb is another word for Sinai. Uh, all that you asked of the Lord your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God. Let me not see this great fire anymore, or I will die. And so they had said, Moses, you go deal with God. We don't want to do that. We feel like we're going to die if we do that. And so Moses had become the mediator between God and the Israelites, between God and man. And in the same way, there's promised a future prophet, a future mediator, who will again mediate between God and not just Israel, but God and all mankind. And of course, I'm speaking of the Son of God. I'm speaking of Jesus. So he is a prophet, as Moses would say, a prophet like me from among you. Verse 18, I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you. Now, this is God speaking about Moses and what he's going to do. And I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak them all that I command him. Jesus did that. Verse 19, it shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words which he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. This future prophet is going to be, he's going to be something else. He's going to be representing God in the ultimate sense. Now we have, and I'm just going through a few of the laws, a few samples of this. Chapter 22 and verse 5, we have some comments about gender roles. Notice a woman shall not wear man's clothing. Now, I know that styles have changed typically throughout history. What both men and women wore back then, that's not what we wear today. And that's okay. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But even today, have you noticed that generally speaking, there are things that women wear and there are things that men wear, and they're not the same things. And that's the point. A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on woman's clothing, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. What you wear is to reflect who you are, your gender. Notice there's only two genders. We shouldn't have to say things like that, but our society of late has gone in some very bad situations. I think they need to go back and read the law. Verse 8, when you build a new house. Now, notice this is about life safety. And I'm an old retired firefighter. I was a battalion chief with the fire department. So I know all about building codes and things like that. I was actually a fire inspector, among other things. Notice, when you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof so that a parapet's like a low wall around the roof. And you say, why do you have that? Well, that's because they would actually go up on top of their roof. That was part of their living space. And you're to have a wall there so that you will not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone falls from it. You're supposed to build your house in such a way that it is construction safe. And we do that all the time. In fact, now there's no law where I live that to be a parapet around the roof of your house because our roofs are slanted. It rains way too much here to have that sort of flat roof. And so we don't have that. But we do have similar laws. For example, there's a law that if you have a swimming pool in your backyard, there is supposed to be a fence to stop little children from accidentally walking in and falling in and drowning. And that's a law very much like this one. So that there's a correspondence notice between the laws back then and the laws that we have today, if they are just and good laws. And that one that we have about swimming pools, I think that is a good law. Chapter 23, verse 21, this law is about vows. When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for it would be sin in you, and the Lord your God will surely require it of you. However, if you refrain from vowing, it would not be sin in you. So, if you don't have to make a vow. You can say, Lord, I want to do this, but I'm not sure that I'm going to make it, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You can pray to the Lord, you can speak to the Lord, but when you make a vow, make sure you keep it. Make sure that you keep your vows. You shall be careful to perform what goes out from your lips, just as you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God, what you have promised. So, make sure you tell the truth. Do that. Chapter 24, verse 6 is about livelihood. No one shall take a handmill or an upper millstone in pledge, for he would be taking a life in pledge. A pledge was where somebody's promising to do something, and you would take an important thing that belongs to them, and they only get it back if they fulfill their promise. This is sort of like offering up something as a pledge, as a promissory note. But notice you're not supposed to take something that allows them to make a living, because if they are unable to keep it, then that means they are unable to make a living anymore. So that just wouldn't be right. And we have similar laws like that in our country as well. Chapter 25, verse 4, notice about labor and wages. You shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. Threshing is when you take the grain that you've cut down, and you're ready to prepare it for use. But before that, you have to take something very heavy and drag it over it a bunch of times. And since it is very heavy, you usually use your oxen for that. You would tie that heavy thing, maybe a stone, maybe a big giant piece of wood or something, and the ox would drag it back and forth over the grain, grinding it up. And then once that's done, you're going to take the grain, you're going to throw it up in the air, and the chaff that will be broken up from it will float away in the wind, and the grain, which is heavier, will fall right back down. Which means I'm going to be walking over all of this grain, and oxen get hungry, and every once in a while they're going to reach down and grab a bite to eat. And somebody who doesn't want his ox to eat any of that food might be tempted to take the ox's mouth and muzzle it so he can't chew, he can't eat. And the point here is, no, he's doing the work. He ought to partake in a little bit, not all of it, but he ought to partake in some of the fruits of that labor. And we find out in the New Testament, when Paul quotes this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, this applies to not only oxen, but all sorts of issues, even why you might pay your pastor a salary. If he is laboring for you, he gets to participate in the fruits of that labor. He gets a salary. Verse 13, chapter 25, verses 13 through 15. Still under labor and wages, you shall not have in your bag differing weights, a large and a small. You say, well, what's that about? Well, you would have a weight, and it would have a little note on it, inscribed on it, as to how much that weighs. Remember, they didn't have coins, they didn't have dollar bills, so they would value things by their weight, whether it's silver or gold. And so it might say 2 pounds. Well, if you have 2 pounds, don't have two different weights that say 2 pounds, and yet they're really different weights. that would be that would be cheating. So don't have a cash register that cheats. Don't have in your bag different weights, a large and a small. You shall not have in your house differing measures. Now this is a little bit different. A large and a small. You shall not have a full and just weight. You shall have a full and just weight. Keep it truthful. You shall have a full and just measure. Same thing if it's in the house, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Uh, Treat your employees and your employers fairly. That's the point that's being made. Now we get to chapter 27, and there's a section here for the next 4 chapters on blessings and cursing, so that in chapter 27, they are instructed when you get into the land. Now they're not there yet, but when you get there, there's these two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. They are side by side with a little city of Shechem in the middle. Those mountains are still there today. And you're to go to Mount Ebal in the land of Canaan and set up an altar specifically on that mountain. And then you will go to these mountains, Gerizim and Ebal, and you will read forth the requirements, the curses and blessings of the law. By the way, they believe they have found that original altar on Mount Ebal. Archaeologists have done that. And there are folks that still go to that area to worship. They are known as the Samaritans. You say, well, I thought Samaritans were only back in the New Testament. No, there are still some Samaritans there today, and they still worship in that area. Chapter 28 then are the curses and blessings which are pronounced for breaking versus keeping the covenant. And curses if you break it, blessings if you keep the covenant. And they're to go to these two mountains, and they're going. Half of them are going to stand on one mountain, the other half are going to stand on another. And one side will call out the blessings, and the other side will call out the curses. And this is actually a way, instead of running between two pieces of animals, they're going to stand on two different mountains, and it's a way for them to signify that the covenant has been made and ratified when they get into the land. But God's already doing that right now with them. So in chapter 29, we read that these are the words of the covenant. And as you go through that, we find out that that covenant will continue in the future from generation to generation. Just because this generation dies out doesn't mean that the covenant's going to end. It's going to continue throughout the generations. And finally, we get to chapter 30, and we see that heaven and earth are called as witnesses to the covenant. So this covenant is established here in Deuteronomy, but it will continue as they go into the land. Finally, we have chapter 31. There's a closing counsel of Moses where he tells both the people and Joshua, be strong and courageous. Now, in Joshua chapter 1, we're going to see that echoed there. It's going to be the refrain in Joshua chapter 1, but we're not there yet. In chapter 32, we read the Song of Moses, and it goes back all the way to the creation and talks about God's wonder and God's glory and all the things that God has done, bringing God's people all the way up to the present. Chapter 33, we see Moses blessing each of the tribes. It reminds me a little bit of how at the end of Genesis that Jacob called all of his sons, all 12 of his sons, and gave each one a blessing. Moses does that here with the tribes. Those sons became tribes, and he blesses each one of the tribes. And finally, we get to chapter 34, and now we read of the death of Moses. And the fact that we read about him actually dying tells me that Moses, I don't think he wrote that part, which tells me I think Deuteronomy is largely given by Moses, but it's a retelling, and now it has been maybe sort of repackaged because now did Moses write chapter 1 through 33? I don't know. I wasn't there. I think it's largely from him, but it has been now repackaged and is being re-given at a later date. That's how this is worded, chapter 34, beginning in verse 10. Since that time, this is after Moses has died, Since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, for all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against the Pharaoh, all his servants, and all of the land, and for all the mighty power, and for all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of Israel. Notice when it says, no prophet has risen, I don't think that was written the next day after Moses had died. I think this is written at a later date. Now, how much later, I don't know. But I do think it's written at a later date by somebody else. Uh, I guess it could have been Joshua, but it could have been somebody much later than that. And that would be okay. That they take what Moses has left and now they sort of package it again with this ending, which this is obviously not the hand of Moses writing this part. So yes, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, and yet there was a promise that we saw back in chapter 18. There's going to be a prophet like Moses. But here at the end, we say, but he's not here yet. He hasn't come yet. And he doesn't come, we know because we're living after the fact, he doesn't come until Jesus is born and comes and ministers and lives and dies and rises again, showing that he's a prophet, yes, like Moses, but much greater than Moses. He is, yes, a prophet and a priest and a king, and he is our Lord and Savior.